Imagine you just spent 3 years mastering something. You know it inside out. You could talk about it for hours. And then someone asks you to explain it simply, and you completely fall apart. This happens to some of the brightest people on the planet, consistently. And there's a real psychological reason why intelligence, the very thing we assume makes someone a better communicator, can actually make them worse at it. Today we're going to unpack why that is. We'll look at what's happening inside the mind of a high IQ individual when they try to explain something. We'll explore the specific cognitive traps that pull them away from clarity, and then we'll get into the habits that actually fix it, because this is a learnable skill, not a fixed trait. If you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling more confused than when you started, or if you've ever struggled to make a smart idea land with a normal human being, this one is for you. Let's start with a concept called the curse of knowledge. In 1990, a Stanford psychology student named Elizabeth Newton ran a simple experiment. She divided people into 2 groups, tappers and listeners. The tappers were given a list of well-known songs, things like Happy Birthday or the national anthem, and asked to tap the rhythm on a table. The listeners had to guess the song. Before each round, the tappers were asked to predict, what percentage of listeners do you think will guess correctly? The actual result? 2.5%. Here's the thing. When the tappers were tapping, they could hear the song in their heads. The full melody, the words, all of it. The problem is, the listeners couldn't hear any of that. All they got was a series of knocks on a table. The tappers genuinely couldn't imagine not hearing the music. They'd forgotten what it was like to not know it. That's the curse of knowledge. Once you understand something deeply, it becomes almost impossible to remember what it felt like to not understand it. And for high IQ individuals, this curse runs especially deep. When you learn quickly, when connections come easily, when you naturally process at a faster rate than most, you accumulate knowledge fast. And the faster it accumulates, the harder it becomes to track exactly how you got there. The steps start to blur, the path disappears. And what's left is just the answer, the conclusion, the insight, which you then hand to someone who hasn't taken a single one of those invisible steps. It's like giving someone the last page of a mystery novel and wondering why they're not moved. They didn't take the journey. This is the first trap, and it's sneaky, because it feels like clarity from the inside. The person with the high IQ isn't trying to confuse anyone. They genuinely believe they're being clear. The model in their head is so vivid, so complete, they assume it must be transmitting. But it isn't. Now, let's go deeper, because the curse of knowledge is just the entry point. There's a second layer to this, and it has to do with how intelligence actually changes the way you think. High IQ minds tend to think in systems, not just in isolated facts, but in relationships between facts. Patterns, exceptions, layers of nuance. When a high IQ person considers a question, their brain doesn't just pull up one answer. It pulls up a web. A dense, interconnected web of qualifications and caveats and competing perspectives. That's genuinely valuable for problem solving. It's genuinely terrible for conversation. Because when you speak from that web, you speak in all directions at once. You start a sentence and halfway through, you remember an important exception, so you add a clause. Then you remember a related concept that gives the exception context, so you extend the clause. By the time you reach the end of the sentence, even you have forgotten what the beginning was. Sound familiar? There's actually a term for this in cognitive science. It's sometimes called overinclusion. The mind is so aware of complexity that it refuses to simplify. Every simplification feels like a lie. Every shortcut feels like intellectual dishonesty. And so the high IQ communicator keeps adding more context, more nuance, more precision, until the person on the other end just stops. Here's the brutal irony. In trying to be more accurate, you become less understood. The message that was supposed to inform actually obscures. The intelligence that was supposed to help becomes the barrier. There's also a social dimension to this that doesn't get talked about enough. Many highly intelligent people grew up being praised for complexity, for using big words, for knowing more than others their age, and over time, that praise becomes identity. Simplicity starts to feel like a step down, like dumbing it down, like losing something. So even when a part of them knows they need to be clearer, there's resistance. Because being complex has always felt like being smart. And being smart has always felt like worth. That's a heavy thing to sit with, but it's important because you can't fix a habit you haven't named. So, what actually changes this? What are the habits that rewire how intelligent people communicate? The first is what I'd call the single thread rule. When you're about to explain something, identify the one thing, just one, that you need the other person to understand. Not 5 things, not 3, 1. Everything else gets cut. Not forever, not from your mind, but from this moment, this exchange. The web is still there, but you're only pulling one thread right now. This is harder than it sounds for a high IQ mind. It requires a kind of ruthlessness, a willingness to say, I know all of this, and right now, none of it matters except this. The second habit is feedback seeking. Not the polite kind, not, does that make sense, which almost always gets a yes regardless. Real feedback. Specific questions. What did you take away from what I just said? Or, can you say back to me what you understood? That might feel uncomfortable. It should, because it puts your communication to a real test. And smart people, who are used to being right, often discover in that moment that their clarity existed only in their own head. That's useful information. The third habit is the most counterintuitive one. It's this: use stories instead of systems. The human brain was not built to process abstract information efficiently. It was built for narrative, cause and effect, a character who faces a problem, a moment of change, a resolution. Stories don't just make things easier to understand, they make things stick. They bypass the analytical skepticism that greets a logical argument and go straight to something deeper. The most effective communicators in history, the great teachers, the great leaders, the great speakers, they didn't lead with data. They led with story. The data came later to confirm what the story had already made you feel. High IQ individuals often resist this because story feels imprecise. It feels soft. But here's the reframe. A story that lands and is remembered is infinitely more precise than a technically accurate explanation that is immediately forgotten. Precision in communication is not about how much you include. It's about how much stays. So, let's bring this together. The reason high IQ individuals often struggle with simple communication is not a character flaw. It's a predictable outcome of several real cognitive and psychological forces working together. The curse of knowledge makes them forget what it's like to not understand something. The tendency toward systemic thinking makes them speak from complexity rather than toward clarity. And the identity built around intelligence can make simplicity feel threatening. But none of this is fixed. All of it is learnable. The single thread rule, real feedback, story over system. 3 habits, that's it. Not because communication is simple, it isn't. But because the entry point to changing it is. Here's the line I want to leave you with. True intelligence is not the ability to hold complexity. It's the ability to choose, in any given moment, exactly how much complexity to show. The smartest thing you can do is make someone else feel smart for understanding you. If this landed for you, consider sharing it with someone who is brilliant, but occasionally a lot to follow. They'll either thank you or give you a very detailed explanation of why you're wrong. Either way, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.